All right, let's dive into the Bible Project video.
The book of the prophet Hosea. Hosea lived in the northern kingdom of Israel, which he sometimes calls Ephraim or Jacob, about 200 years after they had broken off from southern Judah. Remember the story from 1 Kings. Hosea was called to speak on God's behalf during the reign of one of Israel's worst kings, Jeroboam II. The nation was descending into chaos, and in the year 722, the big bad Assyrian Empire swooped in and decimated Israel. Again, see the story in 2 Kings. And Hosea had seen all of this coming. The book is a collection of some 25 years of his preaching and writing. It's almost all poetry. And this whole collection has been designed to have 3 main sections. Let's just dive in and you'll see how it works. The opening part tells the story of Hosea's broken marriage to a woman named Gomer, who commits adultery. Now, it's not totally clear whether Gomer slept around with other men before or only after they got married, but they did have 3 children together and things fell apart. The important point is that God tells Hosea that despite Gomer's unfaithfulness, he is to go find her, to pay off her debts to her lovers, and to commit his love and faithfulness to her once again. And then God says that all of this, the broken and repaired marriage, the children, it's all a prophetic symbol, telling the story of God's relationship to Israel. So God has been like a faithful husband to Israel. He rescued them out of slavery. He brought them to Mount Sinai, where he entered into a covenant with them. He asked them to be faithful to him alone. But then he brought Israel into the promised land, and they took all the abundance that he gave them, and they dedicated it to the worship of the Canaanite god Baal. And so God has a legitimate reason. He could end the covenant and divorce Israel, and he thinks about doing so, but instead, he says that he's going to pursue Israel again and renew his covenant with them. And he says why? It's purely because of his own love, compassion, and faithfulness. Hosea then spells out what all this means. He says the consequences for Israel's rebellion will be imminent defeat by other nations and exile. But there's hope for future restoration. One day Israel will once again repent and come back to worship their God. And Hosea says he will place over them a new messianic king from the line of David who will bring God's blessing. And so this opening section introduces all the main ideas of the book. Israel has rebelled, and God's going to bring severe consequences, but God's own covenant love and mercy are more powerful than Israel's sin. And so in the remaining sections of the book, Hosea's poetry explores these themes in more depth. So there are 2 collections of his accusations and warnings for Israel, and then each of these is concluded by a very hopeful poem about God's mercy and hope for the future. So chapters 4 through 10, Hosea explores the causes and effects of Israel's unfaithfulness. He says numerous times that Israel lacks all knowledge or understanding of God. The Hebrew word to know, which is yada, it's more than just intellectual activity. It describes personal relational knowledge. It's the difference between just knowing about someone and then actually knowing that someone. And God wants Israel to know him like that, in a relationship. He wants them to experience his love for them and become the kind of knowledge that transforms their hearts and lives so that they love him in return. And so this is why Hosea is constantly exposing the hypocrisy of Israel's worship. He constantly shows how they're breaking the 10 Commandments, how they're allowing grave injustice in their communities, and then they go to their sacred temples and they offer sacrifices to God like everything is just fine. But it's not fine. And not only because of their hypocrisy, but because they're worshiping all of these other gods too. He mentions many times their altars to Baal at the cities of Bethel and Gilgal. And not only have they given their allegiance to other gods, Hosea repeatedly accuses Israel for trusting in their political alliances with Egypt and Assyria. So instead of trusting God to protect them, they want to become like these nations and rely solely on military power. And God says it's all going to come crashing down on their heads, because in not too long, Assyria will turn on them and come to ravage their lands. In this other section of warning, Hosea gives an ancient Israelite history lesson to show how this family's been unfaithful from the beginning. So he alludes to the patriarch Jacob's lying and treachery. Remember Genesis 27 and 28. He alludes to Israel's rebellion in the wilderness. Remember the book of Numbers. He alludes to their appointment of the corrupt king Saul, who led the people into sin and disaster. Remember the stories in 1 Samuel. This is all Hosea's way of saying some things in this family never change. So what hope does Hosea have? Well, we know from chapter 3 that God's going to do something to save and restore his people. And that's what these two concluding chapters explore. Chapter 11 is beautiful. The poem depicts God as a loving father who raised his son Israel and then shared everything with him. But the son grew up and rebelled and turned on the father, taking advantage of his generosity. And so in this poem, God is emotionally torn apart. One moment he's angry, and naturally he says he's going to bring severe consequences. But the next moment he's heartbroken. And then he says that he's moved by his mercy and compassion, and he's going to forgive the son that he loves. He says, "How can I give you up, Ephraim? My heart churns inside of me. All my compassion is aroused." And so while God did allow Israel to be conquered by Assyria, face the consequences, that's not God's final word. There's still hope. And that's what the last chapter is about. Hosea calls Israel to repent and turn back to their God, but he knows that it won't last because it never has before. And God says that one day he will heal their waywardness and love them freely. God goes on to describe this new healed Israel as a lush tree that will grow deep roots and broad branches and offer shade and fruit to all of the nations. It's an image of God's promise to Abraham, how Israel was to become a blessing to the nations. And God's saying, if that's ever going to happen, it's going to require an act of God's grace and healing power to repair the deep brokenness and sinful selfishness of the human heart, so that God's people can receive his love and love him in return. This is what God promises to do. Now, after this poem concludes, we find the very last words of the book. They're like an appended note. They're likely from the author who collected Hosea's poetry and now wants to speak to you, the reader, for a second. And he says, "Who is wise and discerning to understand all of this?" In other words, Hosea's poems. "The ways of the Lord are right. The righteous walk in them, but the rebellious stumble in them." So the author wants you to know that Hosea's ancient poetry to northern Israel is not locked in the past. It reveals deep truths about God's character and purposes and human nature. And while God should and does bring his justice on human evil, his ultimate purpose, his heart, is to heal and to save his people. And that's what the book of Hosea is all about.
Ta-da! Class dismissed. Just kidding. All right, so to jump back into chapter 3 in particular, let's just recap chapter 2. It was this big, intense, dramatized fight between a husband and a wife. The kids were caught in the middle, even used as messengers. And it's just the dramatized scene between the conflict between God and Israel, portrayed in the sign act of Hosea and Gomer in chapter 1, which we didn't cover very much of their sign acts. We covered the sign acts of the three kids. So now we're coming back specifically to the Hosea-Gomer relationship and the sign acts that they play. And just an overview of chapter 3, only 5 verses, is just after the intensity of the quarrel between the husband and wife in chapter 2, the prophet's personal life once again takes center stage in a tender scene of redeeming his wayward wife. This forms an inclusio with chapter 1. Chapter 2 is the intense emotional outbreak of the husband's anger and the consequences for the wife's sin. But even that ends on the note of hope and restoration by the end of the chapter. So the poetry and the construction of chapters 1 through 3 as a section are designed to set up the conflict and resolve the conflict in various ways. So chapter 2 not only looks forward to the ending of the conflict, chapter 3 works out that conflict between Hosea and Gomer as sign acts. Chapter 3 is functioning as a brief conclusion to the marriage metaphors of the previous 2 chapters. It's also functioning thematically as a transition from this first section of the first 3 chapters to the next section, 4 through 11, where despite the fact that it ends on a positive note, just like chapter 2 does, chapter 4 on through chapter 10 will just be problem after problem after problem of Israel breaking God's law. Most of the prophets do this, so we're not really going to spend any time on that. We're going to hit chapter 3 and then jump to New Testament uses. So what we're going to do, because chapter 3 is so short, every week, even though we're not going to discuss verses 2 through 5, is we're going to read all 5 verses of it and then dive into a couple of verses at a time. Today, only verse 1. But the text says this: Yahweh said to me, go show your love to your wife again. Though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress, love her as Yahweh loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and a lethek of barley. Then I told her, you are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will behave the same way toward you. For the Israelites will live many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred stones, without ephod or household gods. Afterwards, the Israelites will return and seek Yahweh their Elohim and David their king. They will come trembling to Yahweh and his blessings in the last days. So, 5 verses, but deeply, deeply compact, and we don't have the Hebraic understanding of these ideas, which is why we're going to spend more time breaking it down. Question, Rachel.
Just from the context here, what is the meaning of him buying her? Because he...
We will cover that next week.
Okay.
Yeah.
Figured maybe
Yeah.
there's something I was
The short answer is we're not entirely sure. We just get some different options, and we'll talk about what those options are next week when we actually hit verse 2. So Hosea and Gomer obviously function as sign acts. That's been true since chapter 1. Nothing changes there. And the sign act is, despite the fact that they're going into exile, Yahweh will restore the relationship between Israel and himself, given time. And this foreshadowed restoration between the two parties of Yahweh and Israel is the sign act of Hosea being told, go take your wife back. Even after everything she's done, go take her back. So Hosea embodies Yahweh's irrational and chastising love towards his wayward people who have joined themselves to other gods, just as Gomer has joined herself to other men. Despite her sins against him, Hosea must learn to love Gomer anyways, because Yahweh will love Israel despite her sins towards him. I mentioned this at the beginning of Hosea, that, whoa, that changed. That in embodying this, Hosea has to feel everything that God is feeling. Hosea gets some of the most tender and emotional text in the Old Testament of God's love and mercy because he understands what God is going through with his people, because Hosea is being treated the same way by Gomer, his wife. And so he embodies all of that and expresses God's... It's almost confusing because, like the Bible Project video says, God's just kind of going back and forth. Like, you're going into exile, but I love you too much to hand you over completely. And it just seems almost just bipolar, schizophrenic, if you wanted to use those terms, because you're like, God, make up your mind. Stop going back and forth. But that's the whole point. Hosea's trying to figure out how to express God to a people who despise him, but a God who still loves the people that are despising him. And he taps into that and expresses that because he loves his wife. He's told to love his wife. Go on loving your wife. It's not just a feeling. We tend to, in our culture, just reduce everything down to the base emotional concepts, but it's so much more than that. When God says, go love your wife again, he's saying so much more than just, hey, get over it and just feel your way past it or anything. He's actually saying, go on doing the husbandly things that express love to your wife, because I'm going to go on doing the husbandly things to Israel of being their God and their king. And eventually, they're going to figure it out. Now, we don't actually get any context of, did Gomer eventually get over her lifestyle of sexual sin or not? We don't know. And the text is ambiguous about that for this exact purpose. Little bit of the structure. Chapter 3 is not very long, but it has 2 basic halves. Verse 1, and then 2 through 5. Verse 1 is Yahweh's command and explanation of the sign act. And verse 2 is Hosea's obedience of the sign act. And then he actually goes on and explains the sign act to Gomer, and then he explains the sign act to Israel. And verse 3 is the only time Hosea actually speaks in the whole book bearing his name. So throughout this chapter, but particularly in verses 3 through 5, there's the subtle, almost imperceptible shift where Hosea goes from speaking to Gomer / about Gomer to speaking to Israel and about Israel. It actually, they draw it out and make it more explicit in English translations. It's actually more subtle in the Hebrew, comparatively speaking. But it's meant to indicate that she's the living embodiment of Israel's attitudes and actions corporately, as the book obviously indicated when it says, go take a wife of whoredom, because the people have committed heinous harlotry, was Huang's translation of that. It keeps the alliteration of the Hebrew in mind, which is why I like it. But it's very, very emphatic. It's very, very raw. Sexual sin is on full display, and God makes no sanitizing description about it. The people are whores, and they've done wrong, so go marry a whorish woman. Here, she's being rescued right out of all of that, and it doesn't deny that. But as we go through this, I hope to show you that Hosea, by actually not telling us certain historical details, is actually sparing his wife more shame than she absolutely has to face from her crimes. So, a couple of interesting things here about this ending sign act is, based on its structure, it's actually the kind of the inverse of chapter 1. In chapter 1, each of the explanations of the children's sign acts are given at the end, after the child is born. So the child is born, God gives it the name, and then he explains the name. Here, God gives the command for Hosea to go remarry so that he and Gomer become the next sign act, or the next expression of their marriage's sign act. But then he immediately explains the reason before Hosea gets to follow through with the command in verses 2 through 3. And then you get further explanation by Hosea of the relevance to not only Gomer, but through Gomer, the greater Israelite community. So it's flowing differently. And I think you can see in that this is a pretty big ask of God. But this is the same ask that God makes of all of us. Go continue in fellowship with people that have done nothing but enrage you, hurt you, and quite frankly, just piss you off. Right? It's that kind of notion. Hosea has been nothing but faithful to Gomer. Gomer has done nothing but hurt him, defying their marriage. And God says, now that you understand how I'm feeling, go continue in the relationship. And know for certain that I'm going to fix the relationship between me and the people. So the sign acts in chapter 1 are followed by explanations about their meaning. But here what happens is elaboration from Hosea, not Yahweh, who does the explanations in chapter 1. This is interesting, and it's a departure from chapter 1. Yahweh doesn't actually address the people in chapter 3, only Hosea does. I don't know if it's supposed to be mimicking the distance between the husband and the wife in chapter 2. I don't know if that's in mind here. Maybe that's a reason. I've just given it kind of as an option. Remember that the husband is not talking to the wife in chapter 2. He's talking to the children. He's kind of talking in front of the wife, but not to the wife, to show distance between them. He doesn't even address her by name. He just calls her the woman, the her, the she, uses all these stuff. I don't know if that's particularly another expression of what's going on here, but it's an observation that I made. I don't know how valid it is. We're not going to talk too much about this because we've already talked about the eschatological parts of chapter 2, but I just want to point out that the same eschatological notions are present overall in this conclusion here that chapter 3 is to the chapters 1 through 3 section. Exile and redemption will follow judgment. That's an eschatological idea in the sense that eschatology just refers to the end of exile and whatever comes after. From there, you have to develop, well, is it talking about right when exile ends? Is it talking about the coming of the Messiah? Is it talking about the very end of time? It's all eschatological. It's all the last days. It's all the latter days, these translations of this Hebrew term. But they're all just days after exile. And they're all valid, and they're all emphasizing different aspects of an ending to the conflict between God and Israel that exist in the Old Testament. So there's an element of this where the New Testament gospel writers are portraying Jesus, and this is what we'll get with the first quote of Hosea in Matthew, that Hosea is picturing Jesus, Matthew is picturing Jesus through the lens of Hosea, that's the better way to say it, that Jesus is bringing the end of the exile. The people are still scattered out there. There's only a remnant living in the promised land. Everybody else is out in Gentile territory. I want you to see that when we get to Matthew, that the true ending of the exile wasn't when the Jews from Judah, a couple of Benjamites tribes and a handful of Levites came back when Cyrus of Persia let them come back. Most of them still remain in exile, away from God, away from the promised land, away from the temple. And then here comes Jesus, and Jesus' ministry is actually ending the exile and bringing Israel back to God in mass, but also the Gentiles along with it. That's an eschatological idea without having to be about the end of time specifically. That's why you have to go from prophets like Hosea and Amos, the writing prophets very early, to apocalyptic literature like Daniel or Revelation, actually talking about the very end of human history. It develops out of that because it's not clear in the prophets when what time frame they're talking about, because for them it's all future. And then later prophets will talk about specifically the very, very end, and we call that apocalyptic. So if you're not talking about Daniel, if you're not talking about Revelation, you have to ask questions of the text. Is this author talking about the very end, or is he just emphasizing the end of the exile in his own way? Is he emphasizing the coming of the Messiah? Is that the very end when the Messiah finally comes and doesn't leave again? Or is it the time of his birth? Micah will speak of his birth. Okay, one more thing of note on chapter 3, before we get into verse 1, is that love is the key word. It's repeated 4 times in one verse, the verse we're going to read today. In English, it shows up 5 times. They add a gloss there to smooth out the language. But it binds the chapter together thematically, showing the point of chapter 3, and really the point of Hosea, because he's going to do this over and over again in different ways, whether or not he uses the term love, as he does here. Yahweh's discipline and judgment are only temporary. They will come to an end. Discipline and judgment are supposed to be part of a larger process of God loving his people and drawing them back towards himself. So love triumphs judgment. Judgment ends. Love doesn't end. God's love will keep on going beyond the judgment that is justly poured out on people because of our crimes against our God. But those crimes, those penalties will end, and blessings in life can be restored again. So the heart of God is loving reconciliation with his wayward wife. If I was to sum up chapter 3 in a statement, it would be that statement, because it says, go show love to your wife again, though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress. Love her as Yahweh loves the Israelites, though they turn to the other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes. Now, what do you know about this verse? What or who is not explicitly mentioned by name?
Gomer.
Correct. Gomer is never explicitly mentioned in this chapter by name. She is merely called Hosea's wife. So I bring that up because some commentators kind of foolishly think that there could be another woman other than Gomer being mentioned here. Okay, he divorced Gomer. Gomer left because she was shacking up with other men. And this is now another woman that he's going to take as his bride. But she's essentially got the same character as Gomer. And it would, in fact, completely undermine the point of the text. The story being built since chapter 1 is that one specific woman is acting this way, and God is working through Hosea with this specific woman in this specific relationship to describe his specific relationship with Israel and what he's going to do about it. The whole point is that Hosea is supposed to be going on loving that exact woman again. So God doesn't cast his people out, and he doesn't start over with a new people, no matter how much he screwed up. God's not going to be proven wrong, that he was wrong to decide Abraham and his descendants through Isaac were problematic and that he's not big enough to solve that problem. That's not true. And so God is always going to use the people that he elected. Even when his people rebel against him, he can and will determinedly stick with them and use that. If Hosea was going out and starting over with a brand new wife, that would completely undermine it. But it comes up because in chapter 2, why does it look like he's paying a bride price if he's already married to her? That's the kind of stuff we'll deal with next week. So, in all likelihood, her lack of name is just threefold. First, her name's already been given in chapter 1. We already know who she is. This is not that long ago. I know we've taken weeks to break down chapter 2, but you can read chapters 1 through 3 in 3 minutes, just straight through. So the reader doesn't need to be told her name again to know who Hosea's wife is to be identified with. Also, that's just how good literature works. You do not have to spell out every detail all the time. So there's no reason to think that, and why I think it's foolish. Also, just to reiterate, chapter 2 is designed to portray distance between the husband and wife. Maybe by not mentioning her again, it's just another way of doing the same thing, showing distance between Gomer and Hosea. Hosea gets called by, naming was very important in Old Testament times, right? Not to use a person's name could be considered very disrespectful in some cases. For Gomer to not be called by name is a little bit of possibly saying the woman has lost her identity in a way. She's lost her way since chapter 1. You'll find in like the book of Ruth, for instance, when Boaz goes to Ruth and Naomi's relative and says, you're the closer relative, you need to marry Ruth, or you need to redeem the land. And he says, yeah, sure, I'll redeem the land. I'll buy it back so it stays in the family. And then at the year of Jubilee, it defaults back to them. And so he's very willing to do that. And Boaz says, you also need to marry the woman Ruth and raise up kids for her. And he says, no, I can't do that. So I'll just let you redeem them, so you sell it. In Hebrew, that guy actually loses his name. He doesn't get a name. He's actually, in Hebrew, it would be called something like Mr. So-and-so. Because it's like he wasn't willing to actually, he wanted the land, he was willing to make the economic investment in it, but he wasn't willing to invest in Ruth. He didn't want to invest in her or her real redemption by having kids with her. So he lost his name. He's not a character in the story by default. It could be something going on the same way in this portion. Again, maybe not, because we already know who she is. So it's hard to say.
In the same vein, he only married Gomer knowing that she was an adulteress by explicit order. If you were to go on to another woman who was also adulterous, like what would be the impetus for that?
Yeah, I mean, what is the change? Where's the story moving forward?
Tell him, here's your type.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make any sense to expect the same storyline to continue.
I agree. I think all of that makes perfect sense to me. I will say, it's an argument from silence. Oh, she's not named, therefore it opens up the possibilities. Technically, that's true if you just divorce chapter 3 from 1 through 3, which commentators do sometimes, which is part of why we're covering 1 through 3 as a unit, but we're not going to cover 4 through 11 or 12 through 14 as these units, because once we get through this, you've seen enough. But you get the portrait here. It's the same story continuing, right? It makes more sense thematically.
It feels like an answer looking for a problem.
Yeah, okay. An answer looking for a problem. And because I will say, the reason you have to be careful with commentators, even the best of commentators, is in part because you're looking to get your work published. So the more you have a new idea or kind of an out there idea, the more likely the publisher is to publish it because it's different than what the other guys are doing. So maybe that's a reason why some people default to this understanding, is they can make more speculative arguments and get their work printed. Finally, by not explicitly naming her again, she's more easily able to portray the corporate Israelite community here, which is her role. She's not functioning as a historical person, as we've talked about. None of the sign acts are. Not even Hosea is functioning in the story as a historical person. His role is to portray God in the relationship with Gomer. So, by not naming her, Hosea is in part keeping more emphasis on Israel, not drawing too much attention to his wife. I think that's better rationale for why doesn't he just explicitly say Gomer? He doesn't have to. It's more to his point. It shows us his emphasis. But finally, I think it actually does spare her some shame in an honor-shame culture, even though he didn't have to, which tells us something about Hosea's heart towards his wayward wife. So the text says, go show love to your wife again. The NIV moves some words around in Hebrew. A more accurate reading would be Yahweh said to me again. Meaning, chapter 3 is some time has passed since chapter 1. We don't know how much. We don't know how long they've been married. We don't know how long Gomer, since the birth of the last kid, has left. We don't know how much time has passed. But the Hebrew is actually designed to point to the passing of time and pick up with a new portion of the same story later on. If you're watching SpongeBob, it would be 5 years later. But not knowing how much later it is. So I think the Hebrew is actually trying to say, Yahweh said to me again, go show love to your wife. And that title, wife, in the story only gives us one option. It has to be Gomer. But both portions have something in common. They open with the idea that Hosea must join himself by marriage to an adulterous woman. 1:2 says, go marry a promiscuous woman. 3:1 says, go show love to your promiscuous woman again. You might as well write that. Though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress there. So thus far in the story, it should be obvious that it should be the same woman, Gomer, and that nothing about her character has changed. But Hosea is expected to love her. He doesn't just say, hey, go bring her back into your household. Go pay her bills. That's not it. That's all an outpouring of actually love this woman. Rachel.
Is there any chance that Hosea has multiple wives in a society that honored plural marriages, and he's specifically referring to this wife?
In the sense that it was historically possible, it's possible. But again, that's just unsubstantiated speculation that we don't have. Within the story that Hosea gives us, it's not possible. Okay. So regardless of the passing of time, Hosea's prophetic commission actually remains exactly the same as when he was first called as a prophet. Love a woman who is not loving back. He has to embody Yahweh's determination to love Israel while understanding God's impassioned hurt by his people. He is supposed to feel this and yet nonetheless be faithful to him. Nothing has changed regardless of how much time has passed. By stripping out a specific time frame, Hosea is probably intentionally, but maybe accidentally, making this more timeless. It doesn't matter how much time has passed. God is always going to love his people. You could take that's a valid takeaway by the fact that he doesn't tell us more details in the story. So again, love is mentioned 4 times in one verse, 5 in English. This one that I haven't bolded, love her as Yahweh loves the Israelites. That's not repeated in Hebrew. It would actually say, love her as Yahweh, the sons of Israel, if you were actually translating that literally. Though she turns to other gods and loves the sacred raisin cakes. So it's the densest verse in the Bible on love, mentioning it 4 times. 1 Corinthians 13 doesn't even use the word that much in a single verse. So the heart of God is on full display here. He loves his people, and that love goes beyond his people's waywardness. And Hosea has to embody that, and so do we. We have to learn to love other people, first and foremost our spouse, then our family, then everyone else, as if they were family. And here you can see that God is determined to do that and determined to teach Hosea to do that. We can learn that lesson. This is probably the best verse in the Old Testament for the idea that God is not a loving God in the Old Testament. I mean, if it's the densest verse in the entire Bible, 31,102 verses in the Protestant Bible, this one is the single densest use and explanation of the term love on full display here. And it comes in the Old Testament, in the prophets, where people think that God is just mean and that God is just rude and upset and angry. And then that's just the God of the Old Testament. Wrong. The God of the Old Testament is the God who loved us enough to send his son to die on the cross, paying the bride price to buy us Gentiles back from the gods that we worshiped. Adulteress here, the root word is na'af. It's in its participle form, if that matters to you. And it's slightly different than the word used in chapter 1, zanah. Zanah is the word for whoredom, prostitution. Whether or not it's specifically requiring Gomer to be a prostitute is unclear. But the latter verb, zanah, can denote any sexual activity outside marriage. This former term, used here, na'af, refers more specifically to the liaisons of husbands and wives with someone not their spouse. So it has to be someone that Hosea is married to. The only option we get is Gomer. So it's not like he's going and taking a brand new wife. The term na'af is actually excluding that as a possibility. That's why I bring that up. Also, because at face value, it seems to imply that Gomer violated the marriage vows sometime after the events of chapter 1 and the birth of the children, and is now off on her own with another man. But no actual details of her sins are forthcoming. More is implied than explicitly described. The question is why? Again, because the historical reality isn't the point. Just like the sign acts in chapter 1, the purpose is not her story as a person, beyond the general notions of her attitudes and heart, but the metaphorical function she plays within the prophetic narrative as a sign act. Let me just hammer that point home. The same is true for Hosea. We don't know anything about what he's been doing, what he's been up to raising these kids while their mother is gone. Hosea is just not concerned with giving us any more information about himself or her than the role they're meant to play before God in the message to Israel. Even if he did, the editors compiling Hosea's work have excluded that. Maybe that's a possibility. We don't know. But again, I mentioned this, he's also limiting the amount of shame that can be thrust upon her, which is very, very interesting. Because if your first thought was, okay, I need to go love my wife even after she's done all this, how many of us would default to, great, so let me go verbally beat her up for what she's done and accuse her of it. She knows what she's done. It's societal. All of society knows what she's done. Because all of society is in on the marriage. They're just not supposed to be in on the sexual part of the marriage. They approve of the marriage. And so they know. They know. And Hosea is actually trying to, in reestablishing the love aspect between them, might actually be reducing the amount of shame that can be thrust upon her intentionally by just saying, okay, she's with another man despite the fact being married to me, and that's all you need to know. Nothing more there. By doing this, the focus actually remains on God's love for her, not on her specific sins or their punishment, which is a very human thing to focus on. We like to focus on the sins of other people because it helps us actually detach from our own sins and being responsible for dealing with our own sins. If that person's worse than me, I feel better about my sins and won't do anything about them. By Hosea actually wording it this way and describing it this way and not describing it this way, he's actually emphasizing God's love despite the shame that she's brought on her, and focusing on hope and reconciliation after the consequences have played themselves out. Which is very, very interesting and very, very telling for Hosea as a writer, the text and what God is actually trying to communicate. Sometimes you have to ask yourself not only what is here in the text, but when you get good at that, start asking yourself, what's not here? What is Hosea not telling us? And try and figuring out why. Arguments from silence are not great arguments, but they're not invalid just because they're arguments from silence. And so great critical thinkers have to work their way through that. Love her as Yahweh loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods. So In this statement, we see the purpose behind Hosea's asymmetrical love for Gomer, because Yahweh loves the Israelites in an unreciprocated way. That part's obvious. But the main issue with Israel is that they turn to other gods, other Elohim. It goes all the way back to the golden calf story in Exodus 32. They barely make the covenant, and then within 40 days, turn around and break the covenant. So apostasy by turning to other gods is the constant Old Testament refrain in the Hebrew history. It is everywhere from beginning to end. Deuteronomy warns about it over and over again. And Hosea's phrase here, though they turn to other gods, is translated interesting here by the NIV, but it's actually the exact same wording as Deuteronomy 31:20. So it seems like Hosea is probably drawing on Deuteronomy to describe the broken covenant language. I expect that is probably where he's getting his Hebrew wording here. But we don't get clarity on who the other gods are, just like chapter 2. Chapter 2 just lumped them all into the title of Baals, meaning lords. As a general title, it can refer to Baal, the Phoenician high god of the storms, who provided fertility through rain. But nowhere is Hosea actually spelling that out, so it's not just Baal, who they obviously have a history of worshiping with in Elijah and Elijah's time. It's just any of the gods. Just to reiterate the same point made about that in chapter 2, it's because they're all just one big worthless category to Hosea. And compared to Yahweh, the God they're supposed to be worshiping, any other gods is lesser, any of the other gods is worse, any of the gods is destructive. It does not matter which God you pick. So he lumps them into a single category of comparison to emphasize that all of them together as a totality are just powerless. They lack glory compared to Yahweh, who is the living God. And that living God is the God who saves Israel because of his great love in spite of Israel's sins. So don't forget these ideas in chapter 2 when you're reading chapter 3. They're not divorced like that. Then we get this final phrase, and they love the sacred raisin cakes, which is, we don't know much about what sacred raisin cakes are. This is not a picture of them. This is just what I thought was a good picture to represent modern little cakes. So just like the identity of the gods, we just don't get any specifics of what the sacred raisin cakes are. It must have made sense to Hosea's audience because he doesn't elaborate on it at all. All we can really do is surmise about this food, what it was, and that it was somehow a part of pagan worship here. I will say the pastries themselves are not inherently sinful. They do crop up in other passages in a positive context. They could be used for legitimate worship, but here they're used for worshiping other gods. Whatever use they were being put to in the worship ceremonies of other gods in Hosea's time, the point is that they're being linked to other gods. But the real point of bringing them up, regardless of what they looked like or tasted like, or how they were used in worship, is they represent a desire for comfort over what is right. That's the real point. And as they come up in a few other contexts that you can read a couple more times in Hosea, I think, but also in like Amos or Micah, I don't remember who, they come up because the Jews, well, they're not called Jews yet. They haven't come back to Judea from exile. The idea is they're turning worship into whatever they most like. And although eating a meal with Yahweh, as I've reiterated before, was the fundamental point of worship at the tabernacle, in the temple, here they're just saying, you know what? It's just easier for us to decide what we want to bring. And it's an attitude of convenience and self-love rather than obedience and sacrifice in love towards God. And certainly we don't have that attitude, right? We would never sacrifice our convenience and our happiness the way that our worship services go, the way anything in our church go. We would never have the attitude where we would prefer comfort above sacrifice, right? Well, that's a fundamental thing that the prophets have to deal with over and over again. And as long as that's the takeaway from a phrase like this, we just don't know. There's not enough recovered. There's no consensus about what they were or how they were used, so I'm not giving you any of the options. I just want you to say, sacrifice of our comfort and things that we like, or our preferences, we might say, is actually a part of connecting with God and loving other people. A refusal to sacrifice on that level is a refusal to love other people. And it happens all the time in modern churches, right? So think about that and don't be that kind of person, right? I'm sure Shauna will mention this as part of VBS closing ceremonies that we're doing today, but they every year the boys versus the girls do a offering to raise money for something, and so this year they always get to punish the pastors for whoever wins or raises the most money or something. So this year Shauna came up with, if the girls win, pink hair for us, which doesn't really do anything but re-up Stefo. If the boys win, it was blue. I'm not telling the boys, but they raised enough money. I'm just going to do blue at some point in the next month or so anyways, because they raised together over $500. So like $550, because like the girls raised just over 300, the boys raised just over 250. So I'm like, hey, it's just hair. It'll grow back naturally. It's not a big deal. So yeah, that's the reason for all of this. I'm going to cut it out of the YouTube the next day, and they're just going to be left wondering for the next few weeks without context.